Department of Education announced a proposed change to Title IX yesterday to prohibit, quote, categorical bans on transgender student athletes. If adopted, it would be illegal for schools or universities to bar transgender student athletes from participating on sports teams consistent with their gender identity just because of who they are, the department said.
According to ABC, while one-size-fits-all prohibitions would be in violation of Title IX should the rule pass, but schools would have the discretion to develop eligibility rules for sports teams that could restrict transgender athletes' ability to participate on a case-by-case basis. However, those restrictions would be reviewable by the DOE, so this is definitely a rule that is telling states and schools what they can and can't do. A senior education department official said, quote, the proposed regulation would give schools flexibility to identify their own important educational objectives. They might include, for example, fairness in competition or preventing sports-related injuries.
20 states have implemented laws prohibiting transgender students from, quote, participating in sports consistent with their gender identities. And according to the Movement Advancement Project, a gender equality centered according to that gender centered think tank. So yes, of course, these state laws are prohibiting schools and people from doing what they want to do. All laws prohibit people from doing what they want to do. The question is what the standard should be. So is the government saying that there shouldn't be a blanket prohibition against saying no trans people in sports of the identity of that they identify as, but you can potentially bar people on the basis of not having been on hormones for long enough, not having surgically transitioned, and other kinds of standards that bodies like the Olympics have taken up over the years to try to create some semblance of equality for cis female athletes. What do you make of it?
Well, the reason I added that about the clarity that this does actually restrict what states and schools are able to do is because the department is kind of trying to have it both ways here, right? So they want to say, okay, no blanket bans, no, for example, laws that fully prohibit anyone born biologically male from participating in women's sports, but in a case-by-case basis, the department's going to review it. So I think that regardless has a big chilling effect. These are regulations, not laws. So, I mean, my view on this, I think it's quite simple. I think that male and female bodies are incredibly different. They're different in ways that are not adjustable by hormone levels and surgical intervention. Those interventions don't change the truth of the differences between male and female bodies. And sports is a context where those differences are very important. It might not matter, sitting around the table talking to each other or who can become a chemist, but it matters very much how fast one can swim the 200-meter butterfly. And so I think this is one more step that the department actually carved out sports because it's such an obvious and clear issue about women's sports and males participating in women's sports. The department carved this issue out from their previous Title IX regulatory drops in which, for example, they identify the term sex as including gender identity, which would have sweeping consequences for sports, except they kind of pushed it off until after the election. So this is right before the midterms when they included that. So I think this is basically, that's why I added some stuff to this, is because this was an attempt by the department to avoid the political consequences of their original rulemaking back before the 2022 elections. They're dropping it now, this carve-out about sports that actually in some ways walks back some of their language from the first batch of regulations where they do define sex as fully including gender identity, which would essentially obliterate the ability of states to distinguish between male and female under the law if those regulations are actually become final, which they have not yet.
Yeah, it's interesting because the reaction from liberals and the broad left on this issue is that this is a huge compromise that Biden has made after saying that there would be no compromising with protecting the interests of trans people in the context of his primary run. He's now saying that people can, while you can't blanket ban, you can choose to bar trans athletes from sports teams if there's some metric short of a ban, if there's a blanket ban, if there's some hook. And again, we'll have to see what that hook ends up being, but many liberals perceive that to be quite a significant betrayal. I do think that this is, so that's just to say that I don't know about the politics of this as you describe it. I don't know that he's winning any any plaudits from any sector with this decision. So if this is a political decision, it seems to me to be a very bad one. I do think that the question of whether or not it is unfair to cis female athletes for trans women to compete in sports is a more difficult one in the grand scheme of kind of trans rights questions. And that's precisely why this issue, which comes up relatively very infrequently, is one that has national importance now and is a national specter, because I think a lot of conservatives who are losing on some other issues, not having any kind of affirmative plan about what to do about inflation, price gouging. There's this huge report about the price of eggs actually being directly linked to price gouging in that industry in particular. Not having an affirmative plan in the wake of Roe being overturned and the majorities of Americans not being happy with that decision, to focus on some of these culture war issues where they do have an edge. And so I'm conflicted, because I do think it's a difficult issue. I think it's of outsized political and national importance right now with the number of people talking about it. And I do think that it would be useful to be having conversations that the Olympics have been having for a long time about what actually is fair. How do you get to a point where it seems fair from a physical perspective to get a trans woman to a place in terms of her hormone levels and estrogen levels and all those other testosterone levels where she isn't having an unfair competitive advantage against cis female athletes? At the same time, that question is complicated by the reality that so many athletes are aberrant in their physicality in the first instance. That's why they're elites. That's why they're so successful. With Michael Phelps having this wingspan that is inhuman and extra ribs and all of this stuff. So, and there are cis women who participate and have an edge because they have naturally high testosterone levels. So how to get around this is, I think, a really difficult question. And I think it's a conversation that I think a lot of people would be more willing to have more openly if it didn't seem like the political consequences of making sure that high school and college sports were fair for cis women to compete didn't seem to implicate some of these broader attacks against trans rights and the hundreds of laws that have come down the pike just this year that want to do things like prevent people from dressing in drag and would make it impossible to put on, a classic Shakespeare production.
So I totally disagree with the characterization of those laws. Those laws are to prevent children from going into sexualized drag shows. I don't think there's any interpretation that would prevent like Romeo and Juliet style cross-dressing.
No, the Republicans just had to revise a bill. I think it was in Tennessee, because it accidentally would have prevented your Hasty Puddings production at Harvard, your classic. Rudy Giuliani couldn't have dressed up in drag and done that video with Donald Trump like he did so famously in the 1990s.
And that people are simply, that the language was not fully reviewed. That's not the intention of those bills, and I think the fact that they're correcting it, the fact that they're going back and correcting it, shows very clearly that that's not the intention of those bills. But to the actual point of women's sports here, I don't think there's any level where it's fair. You can't undo the biological advantages. Your bones are denser. It's not a matter. Like, even the way that our hips are structured is different. Every aspect of the physicality of men and women is quite different. And I think it's frankly, we're having this whole conversation to avoid the fact that males and females are extremely biologically different. There are two sexes, and these regulations in Title IX apply to sports and apply to in the educational context. But for example, you could have a similar debate over Bostock and about Title VII and Title VI, but you can have this debate in all different levels. There's the ERA as well. All of these, the Equality Act, all of these things basically prohibit the law, whether on the state or federal level, from taking into account when men and women's biological differences actually matter. Now, as I said, again, there are not all instances in which those things matter. There are plenty of situations in which it doesn't matter if one is a man or a woman, regardless of how one presents or dresses. But there are some instances where it matters very much. Sports is one of those. Prisons are another, where we have transgender identified male inmates in California, Illinois, Washington, and Oregon being transferred, and New York being transferred into female prisons. We've already seen assaults in those prisons. We've already seen issues of impregnation. These are biological males who are being transferred on the basis of mere self-identification into women's prisons. And there are 1,000 other ways in which women and girls rely on the law to be able to distinguish between men and women, between boys and girls. For example, when we get patted down by a same-sex agent at the TSA, right? So I think generally there's an attack on these distinctions of law. I don't think these issues are a distraction. I don't think that it's at all a distraction to talk about whether our law can recognize the fundamental reality that men are men and women are women. I think that that's a very basic and fundamental issue that is well worth the political energy that we spend to talk about it.
It's hard to have these conversations when people are so definitive about things that are so obviously disproven. So most people do fall very clearly into the male or female category. The whole reason we've been having a years-long conversation about what to do about people like Caster Semenya, the athlete who's been competing as a woman for years now, is because she's intersex. And it's precisely because these are difficult questions and issues that are nuanced on the margins that well-meaning people who are invested both in the rights and interests of cis women being able to compete fairly and not getting hurt in sports, and people who are interested in protecting the rights of Americans who are also trans and who are being targeted by an onslaught of bills that don't seem to be particularly targeted to protecting children, that are banning public drag performances, which is in fact what happened in this Tennessee law, which are people who are advancing policies and saying that transgenderism should not exist, should not be allowed. You should not be allowed as an American to live your life as an adult the way that you want. People are trying to balance those interests. And I think that it's completely fair and legitimate, and people shouldn't be stigmatized for trying to balance those interests. But I do think it would be easier to have the conversation if there was an acknowledgement of how difficult it is that there are people like Caster Semenya, there are people who do not fall into these two categories. And that it's not a gotcha to say, is everybody a man or woman? Because in fact, it's narrow cases. All of these are narrow cases, but she's literally intersex.
So
and
I think this is an attempt, is a Mott and Bailey attempt, right? There have always been a small number, and this is what they are. They're genetic pathologies for the most part. So, for example, Klinefelter syndrome, right, which is when somebody has multiple copies, has XX and Y. Yeah. So three copies of, these are a small number of actual medical pathologies, which is what they are. I'm not using it in a normative sense. I'm saying that these are deviations, and it's no more true to say that there aren't two biological sexes and there isn't a sex binary because intersex conditions exist than it is to say that humans don't have two arms because some people are born with genetic disabilities where they might be born with one arm or no arms. Like that doesn't mean that human beings don't have two arms. So I actually think this is a very it's an attempt to present a small number of documented medical pathologies, and then to present that as though it negates the sex binary, which it doesn't at all. There's a huge and abiding difference between saying that these conditions exist and saying that sex exists, biological sex exists on a spectrum. That's simply not biologically true.
I mean, it is. Definitionally, it's biologically true, even if it is very small, narrow cases. But to say it's narrow and fringe, when one of the most famous instances of trying to figure out what to do with a high-performing athlete is someone who is intersex, to me, if you're not willing to include that as part of the conversation, then you're not having an accurate conversation. And I'm not even substantively disagreeing with much of what you said. I just don't understand why it is a problem to acknowledge that intersex people exist, and not just exist, are right at the heart. The Caster Semenya case was one of the ones that first started this entire conversation all those years ago, and continues to be a real difficult thing for people who have like I said, a vested interest in making sure that cis women can compete safely and fairly, are able to do so.
In her case, and correct me if I'm wrong, because this is a case from, I think, 20 years ago or so. She was a runner, right?
And not quite 20 years ago. Yeah, she was
but in this case, she didn't know that she was interested.
No, she didn't.
So she had a biological advantage, but even there, she had the biological advantage because of her intersex condition. I agree that is a difficult case because she didn't know. She won a bunch of awards and she competed against women who did not have that advantage. Then yes, there's like this kind of very difficult conversation about which biological advantages. Is this more like Michael Phelps' wingspan, or is it more?
Black people have denser bones.
I don't think that's
Black
actually,
women have narrow set hips. I mean, if you go down that line, this is the argument that people make.
That is, I think that is very, very different and very clearly delineated from a condition where you have a very clear biological sex, which is 99.98% of people, has a clear biological sex, and then you have an identity stapled on top of it that is how you feel about yourself, how you want to present to the world. Well, like, people want to present themselves to the world in all different ways, but it doesn't change the underlying biological reality of their sex, and that is highly relevant in the sports context. And frankly, so one of my colleagues, Riley Gaines, was at IWF, was just actually hit by male protesters for saying that it was unfair for her to swim against Leah Thomas. She swam against a biological man who calls himself Leah Thomas, and that was unfair to her as a female athlete. That is just the reality, the biological reality, and I'm not going to shy away. I'm sorry, I'm not going to shy away from saying that, and I'm not going to shy away from saying it's actually a very important conversation. I know that we like to talk about cultural issues as though the real issues, the most important issues, are economic. And yes, economic issues are critical. But it's also very important to a lot of parents in this country whether their daughters will be in locker rooms with fully intact biological boys. That's an important issue for a lot of parents, and I don't think it's a distraction at all. And actually, I think that it's such a strong issue that so many parents feel that way. That's the reason we're having this conversation, and this piece of Title IX dropped after the midterms of 2022 because the Biden administration didn't want Democrats to have to run while this conversation about women's sports was going on in the midterms, and that's why they made this special carve out from the rest of their Title IX regs that they dropped months and months ago.
We'll have more Rising for you right after this.